Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, and this is History 104 Online. And today we're going to be talking about, continue talking about the West, particularly the West after the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, we're going to break this up into 4 different lectures. 5 different lectures. And what we're talking about, starting with the barbarian kingdoms in the West and the development of Western Europe after Charlemagne. Excuse me. So, you may recall that we had mentioned previously that many of the Germanic peoples were converted to Arian Christianity, either when they were living among the frontiers of the Roman Empire, or when they actually entered the Roman Empire. Now, the period from 500 to 750 saw transformations of the Germanic West. Some kingdoms failed and others proved durable, and the lands of Europe were Christianized. Now, in Latin traditions, a cultural blend of classical, Christian, and Germanic elements formed. The early Mediterranean-centered kingdoms began to fail. Now, the Vandals were militant Arians, tyrannical pirates in the western Mediterranean, and finally defeated by Justinian in 532 to 34. The Ostrogoths, although Arians, were promising under Theodoric and blended with Roman society, but they fell to Justinian's wars of reconquest. For the Visigoths, the legacy of their defeat by the Franks, Justinian's attack, Arianism, and political disunity left them in a weakened state, and they fell to Muslim invaders from North Africa between 711 and 716. Now, the Lombards entered Italy in 568 to 569 in the wake of the Ostrogothic defeat. The Byzantines did not accept them, although they did little about them, but the popes opposed bitterly their attempts to extend rule all over Italy and until around 680. Their Arianism. Now, finally, the popes turned to the Franks, who defeated the Lombards in 755, 756, and between 773 and 774. Now, these are all the Germanic tribes that were mentioned a couple lectures ago. And we need to remember that the term Arianism refers to Christians who did not believe in the sanctity or the divinity of Jesus Christ, or the Trinity. Now, the future was left, in a sense, by default to the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks. Now, the Anglo-Saxons were many peoples who entered Britain around 450 to 600 in the wake of the Roman withdrawal. They built several small kingdoms, traditions speak of the heptarchy, that competed with one another. Now, the most effective kingdoms were those that were capably led and had room to expand. Kent and Northumbria, initially, then Wessex, and finally Mercia. Kings ruled from impressive wooden halls and used scepters and issued coins, laws, and even documents. Now, a few documents speak of Bretwaldas, or broad wielders, or perhaps Britain wielders. And some scholars take this to be evidence of an awareness of political unity long before it really existed. Offa of Mercia, who lived from 757 to 796, was the first to call himself King of the English. But in truth, it's hard to know what he meant by this. Kings maintained widespread commercial relations, as we can see from hold on one second, guys. As we can see from the excuse me, the Franks. As we can see. Sorry about that. Offa of Mercia was the first to call himself king, and the kings maintained widespread commercial relations, so we can see from the fantastic ship burial at Sutton Hoo, discovered in 1939. Now, the Franks were a confederation of peoples whom the Romans first encountered along the Rhine in the 750s. Rome made treaties with them, and they played an important role in the history of northern Gaul, which is modern-day France. Gradually, the Franks moved, by slow agricultural expansion, across modern Holland and Belgium into what is now France. And now the Franks expanded against their neighbors, defeating the Visigoths and driving them into Spain, and even conquering the Burgundians. And they also expanded along and to the east of the Rhine, Franks blended with Gallo-Romans, especially through intermarriage. Now, the Franks converted from paganism to Catholicism, although some leaders may have had a brief flirtation with Arianism. From the late 5th century, Frankish leaders were allied with the leading churchmen, abbots, and bishops, and the Franks maintained Roman traditions of rule. The official language was Latin, wills and laws were issued, and courts were held. Now, Clovis, the greatest of the Merovingians, divided his kingdom among his sons. Now, thereafter, there were usually 3 sub-kingdoms: Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy. Now, frequent strife among the Merovingians led to aristocratic leadership, and the greatest of these aristocratic families was the Carolingian, the family that eventually produced Charlemagne, which we'll talk about next. Ireland's political evolution was embryonic, with literally dozens of tiny kingdoms on the island, and no clear movement towards larger political entities, let alone kingdoms, was evidenced in Wales or Scotland by 800. Now, the second great development of the years, we talked about the development of Anglo-Saxony and the development of the Frankish kingdoms. The second great development of the years, from around 500 to 750, was the development of the Catholic Church, which we've talked about a couple lectures ago. Now, in Rome, the popes gradually turned away from the Mediterranean world and entered into relationships with the emerging political leaders of Western Europe. Popes continued to build their institutional leadership in central Italy, the Papal States. Popes became great patrons of art and learning in and around Rome. Now, bishops remained important local leaders. As new kingdoms grew, more bishoprics were created. In the Frankish world, this meant east of the Rhine. Now, in Britain, In Britain, this meant first Canterbury and York, then a whole network of bishops coming together in councils could legislate for the whole realm long before kings could do so. Bishops became key advisors to kings, monasteries spread all across Europe, monks played a key role in converting the people of the countryside, and many missionaries were Irish or Anglo-Saxon monks who traveled far to preach and teach. Monasteries were often important centers of learning. Now, a new cultural life began to manifest itself across Europe. Exuberant decorative motifs entered art with the Celts and Anglo-Saxons. Schools were generally located in monasteries or sometimes at cathedrals, from the word cathedra, meaning seat. A cathedral is the seat of a bishop. Learning based on the Bible and church fathers was intended to foster salvation and bring pleasure or prepare people for jobs. The greatest centers of education were in the north of England. Lindisfarne was a monastery with strong Irish connections that produced a gospel book, now in the British Library, that's a testament to biblical scholarship and masterpiece of book art. The greatest single figure was the Anglo-Saxon Bede, who in a lifetime at Wearmouth and Jarrow wrote history, biblical commentaries, theology, and books on time reckoning. He popularized AD dating, or Anno Domini dating, BC and AD. By about 750, there was another region with peoples professing a universal faith, looking to one holy book, thinking of themselves as the chosen people, and entering complex relationships with the classical tradition. Now, this shows us the shift of the center of power in the west from the south to the north. And we can see a volatile situation in the Mediterranean world, and we can also see the evolution of the world of late antiquity into 3 kindred but distinct heirs of Rome. Now, Charlemagne was the greatest member of the Carolingian family, which arose in the early 7th century in Austrasia, which is the northeastern Frankish kingdom. Now, initially the family's power was based on vast landed patrimonies. Creative marriage policies unified even more lands in the family's hands and built relationships with other powerful families. Now, the Carolingians long controlled the office of mayor of the palace, sort of a prime minister to the Merovingian kings, and they built up close relationships to leading members of the clergy, both bishops and abbots. Now, they waged military campaigns along frontiers that maintained integrity of the kingdom. Charles Martel, for example, defeated a Muslim army near Poitiers in 733 and dramatically enhanced the prestige of his family. Now in 751, the Carolingians finally took over the throne. Pippin III wrote to Pope Zachary to ask if it was right that the person in Francia who had all the power lacked the title of king. Now, Zachary needed help against the Lombards and told Pippin that he should be king. Now, Pippin had already carefully prepared his usurpation with Frankish elites, but papal approval confirmed additional legitimacy. Pippin ruled effectively for 17 years and began rebuilding the prestige of the monarchy, which had suffered under the last Merovingians. Now, the reign of Charlemagne from 768 to 814 marked a turning point in European history. He was a great but complex figure, moral and profligate, humane and vicious, barbarous and learned. His long reign provided many opportunities. His immense patronage brought key people to court, and he was a keen judge of people. Slowly, he worked out and implemented a coherent plan. Now, the historical work of Charlemagne falls under several distinct heads. His military campaigns helped to maintain his realm. He waged 53 campaigns in 46 years. Charles rarely led armies himself. His talent was organization, not generalship. Essentially, he restored the borders of the Merovingian kingdom while rounding off some frontiers. Institutional developments involved both reform and innovation. He made the royal court and courtiers play key players in both government and politics. And he created the impression of wide consultation and consensus. Annual assemblies were held at which the Franks asserted to royal initiatives. Capitularies, or legislation in capitula or chapters, were issued at almost every assembly. Now, key members of the Frankish people were made royal vassals and thus entered into personal relationships with the king. Missi Dominici were wandering envoys sent out to inspect the work of all other officers and report back in an effort to avoid dishonesty and oppression of the weak and poor. Ecclesiastical developments took place in several fronts. A close alliance with the papacy was a hallmark of Carolingian history. An extension of the church hierarchy followed closely on Charles's institutional reforms and military advances. He saw church organization as a complement to, and even an advance on, political organization. His attempts to attain uniformity in canon law, liturgy and worship, and monastic practices went far toward achieving a common culture in Western Europe. The imperial coronation of Charlemagne is one of the signal events in Western civilization. It was occasioned by problems in papal Rome, and it was also prepared by an emergent idea of a universal imperial hegemonic tradition in Francia. The events of Christmas Day 800 led to the creation of a new Israel in Francia. By artfully altering St. Augustine's theology, Charlemagne's courtiers created a political Augustinism that served as the ideological foundation for the new regime. The idea of Christendom was born in Charlemagne's reign. The breakup of the Carolingian Empire was perhaps inevitable. Internal factors included family rivalries among the sons and grandsons of Charlemagne, which tore the realm apart. These reached a culmination of sorts in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. The sheer complexity of the lands and peoples over which the Carolingians ruled made uniformity difficult. Still, we should be impressed with what they achieved. There was, over most of Europe, an absence of any tradition of unified rule. External factors included Viking, Muslim, and Magyar attacks that began in the middle years of the 9th century. The militarization and localization of society as responses to the unpredictable attacks forced people to fall back on locally available resources. Bonds between the center and the localities were slowly dissolved. Still, the century of unified Carolingian rule went far towards stamping a common historical and cultural imprint on Western Europe. Now, as early as 1839, Jean-Jacques Ampère referred to La Renaissance carolingienne. He was writing a literary history of France. Now, what can we have meant? One approach is to reflect on the terms Renaissance, Reform, and Revival, because each has been attached to the Carolingian period as a whole and to its cultural life. Now, another approach is to inquire into the inspirations for Carolingian activity. The Bible was central, as a book, as a source of information, as a literary model. The Christian Roman Empire was important too, that is, the empire of Constantine, not of Augustus. The fathers of the church were copied, studied, and transmitted by the Carolingians. Classical texts and authors are more effective to assess in terms of their influence. Another approach is to emphasize that the movement, whatever we call it, was encouraged, supported, and financed by the Carolingian family. They gave it a coherence and impetus that it could not otherwise have had. The development of schools and the provision of basic education was the first step. The 7 liberal arts, the basic curriculum in antiquity, still formed the basis of education. These arts were grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music. Alcuin divided these into the trivium, or of grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music. Thereafter, the former were the basic education, and the latter the advanced. Now, the school tradition on the continent had not collapsed, but was in serious disarray. The Carolingians came into contact with Anglo-Saxon missionaries on the continent, especially Boniface in the time of Charles Montel and Pippin III. And by the time Charles came to the throne, he attracted Alcuin, the greatest contemporary product of the Northumbrian tradition started by Bede. Now, Alcuin became a friend and trusted advisor to Charlemagne. He prepared theological works, biblical commentaries, poems, and letters. His works have sometimes been dismissed unfairly as elementary and unoriginal. But he was a teacher preparing basics. Alcuin urged Charlemagne to insist that every monastery and cathedral have a school where even lay boys could be educated. Charlemagne also brought in scholars from elsewhere in Europe. They were attracted by his vision and impressed by his commitment of resources. Important grammarians came from Italy. Specialists in theology and liturgy came from the Spanish borderlands. The scholars who came brought books and sought out copies of books they already knew. Slowly, libraries were built up. Many monasteries and cathedrals developed a scriptorium, a writing department, where manuscripts were copied. And as a measure of the work, we have some 180 manuscripts before 800 and more than 6,000 from the 9th century. The movement, or this educational movement, the philosophical movement, had several conscious goals. Enhancing the intellectual quality of members of the clergy to make them better preachers, better teachers, and less susceptible to heresy. The Carolingian ideal of rule derived from the Bible and Gregory the Great's pastoral rule, or ministerial kingship. This held that office was a burden entrusted by God to his servants and to be exercised on his behalf. It did not bring rank, wealth, or prestige. One would be answerable for it. The clergy were to explain this. Secular sanctity is a good name for the ideal preached by the laity. Carolingian teachers did not urge everybody to go off to a monastery. Instead, they were urged to be good, to be holy, to be saintly in their current status and occupation. Christian ethics were to be taught. There were also several unexpected results. Latin was improved from a technical point of view, but ironically killed or turned into a dead language. The natural evolution of Latin was arrested. Henceforth, Romance continued to evolve as a living language, and Latin became a precisely fixed scholarly language. Large amounts of Latin literature were produced, some of it of a very high quality. Now, several major figures were poets who had mastered classical meters, had a fine sense of theme and language, and could write with real feeling. Einhard wrote letters, saints' lives, and a biography of Charlemagne based on the lives of the 12 Caesars by Suetonius. He also happened to be an accomplished architect. Theologians debated such questions as the meaning of baptism, the issue of predestination, and the proper role of religious images. Between 768 and 855, 27 cathedrals, 417 monasteries, and 100 royal residences were built. Of this awesome productivity, not too much survives because buildings were rebuilt again and again. Now, although most manuscripts were homely books with no images, the Carolingian period witnessed a production of several dozen surviving books, and, one supposes, many more, whose painted images are masterpieces of European art. Some of these were produced for the court, such as the great Bibles produced for Charlemagne. Many more books were produced in scriptoria, at such places as Tours, where Alcuin was abbot for the last 8 years of his life. A figure such as Theodulf reveals many trends of the age. He came to court as a theologian to formulate the Frankish response to the Byzantine views on religious art, and he seems to have been the only significant Carolingian writer who knew Hebrew and who could, therefore, deal intelligently with the Old Testament. Charlemagne used him as a missus in the south of France. He was appointed Bishop of Orleans and issued important legislation governing the life and activities of the clergy of his diocese. He almost single-handedly produced an edition of the Bible that remains a marvel of learning, and he was perhaps the finest poet of his age. He also designed a beautiful chapel in Gemegny. Now, Theodulf may have been unusual, but versatility was a hallmark of the age. Hierobonus Maurus was Alcuin's greatest pupil, a key advisor to Charlemagne's heirs, abbot of Fulda, archbishop of Mainz, a poet, a biblical scholar, and an encyclopedist in the tradition of Pliny the Elder. Hincmar of Reims was an archbishop, an advisor to a king, a historian, a theologian of some renown, and the greatest legal mind of the early Middle Ages. Now, the Carolingian period provided the basis for a common European culture, at least at the highest levels of society. This period also built Catholic Christianity into every aspect of life in Europe. At the most basic level, the Carolingians established the framework for European intellectual life until the emergence of the universities in the 12th century. Now let's talk a little bit about the expansion of Europe following the Carolingian Renaissance. Now, the first fundamental fact is a long-term rise in population. The increase began slowly in the Carolingian period, became more intense from around 1050 to 1200, and then slowed from 1200 to 1275, finally leveling off. The evidence is qualitative, not quantitative, including larger families, people living longer, no plague or famine, warmer, drier climate, new land under cultivation, and a better diet. There was modest technological innovation and dissemination. The Romans generally were not interested in technological gains. Medieval people vastly expanded cereal production. How? Now, production was expanded through greater use of horses as draft animals. This necessitated better harnessing and virtually universalized the horseshoe. The new heavy-wheeled plow with an iron share, first introduced from the Slavic world in the Carolingian period, became more widely disseminated as well. Now, water mills were widely used from the 11th century. Mills demanded engineering gains in gearing. Meals were imperative because of the increased ability of grain, and this made more flour available for bread, the staple food. Land began to be more efficiently used. The three-field system, a Carolingian innovation, spread to much of Europe, with more land under the plow and a greater variety of crops. And there was insurance against a season of bad weather. There was a growing tendency to agricultural specialization. People and regions combined to produce what they were best suited to produce. Now, improved roads and transport vehicles made it possible for more goods to travel farther and faster. Agricultural gains in the countryside served to promote far-flung urban markets. Church and secular governments worked to protect trade and traders. Agricultural specialization was also a major impetus to trade. Trade was facilitated by fairs, as in the Charlemagne region, leagues of cities and ports, banking agencies, and contracts, partnerships, and insurance. Several vast commercial networks emerged in addition to intense local exchange. Northern Baltic Seas, Danube Basin, the Rhone-Saône route, Italian cities in Eastern Mediterranean, and the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean via caravan routes. There were greater efficiencies in surface mining as well. This made available more iron and stone, which facilitated farming, warfare, and construction. Transport was crucial in this realm as well. These factors put more money into circulation, facilitated economic specialization, and promoted the growth of towns. Now, early medieval towns were usually seats of government or bishops' sees. In the Carolingian period, many towns had faubourgs, or suburbs, where peddlers and part-time merchants gathered. After 1100, townspeople were increasingly permanent and engaged in trade or industry, artisanal more than heavy, apart from cloth. Townspeople needed different things other than rural elites who dominated society and politics: peace, security, order, supplies of food, and raw materials. Now, changed economic circumstances spawned reflections on the economy. The condition of the poor became more evident. Legislation and preaching turned against usury and lending of money at interest. Theologians and lawmakers defined the concept of the just price. Europe, in what we call the High Middle Ages, was dynamic and prosperous, and such widespread prosperity had not been evidenced since the Pax Romana. So this ends this lecture on the rise of the Carolingian Renaissance and the development of the High Middle Age period. In the next lecture, we're going to be talking about the rise of chivalry in Europe, some medieval political traditions that existed during this time period. We're also going to be talking about the scholastic culture that existed during the Carolingian and the High Middle Ages, and then end with vernacular or popular culture during this time period before moving on to Renaissance Europe in the next couple of weeks. So I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Again, this is History 104 with Professor Hasselman, and I'll see you next time.